And you guys can see how close Iran is to Russia. Iran is very close to southern Russia. And really the only thing that is separating Iran from southern Russia is Azerbaijan. Here's Azerbaijan, which is right on the Caspian Sea. So here's Iran, Azerbaijan, and from Azerbaijan, you have Russia. That's how close they are to each other. Iran is a part of Russia's underbelly. And so Russia cannot afford to fully lose Iran. So if they do a regime change, expect the Russians to become more active in Iran. Expect the Russians to work with much effort to push out NATO's power in Iran and to pull out NATO's clause, which NATO will sink into Iran if and when the Ayatollah regime is overthrown. And Turkey is Iran's neighbor. I mean, they're right next to each other. They share a substantial border with each other. And so if the Ayatollahs are overthrown, the Turks are going to get heavily involved. Let's look at this map. This map has a lot more color. So here is Russia up here. And then you have Iran and then Turkey. Iran and Turkey are neighbors. They border with each other. So Iran's politics are very important for Turkey because they're neighbors. This is like, America and Mexico. Mexico's politics are very important for the United States. Canada's politics are very important for the United States. And so Iran's politics, Iran's political situation is very vital for Turkey. It's very important for Turkey. So Turkey is absolutely focusing on Iran. And Turkey needs Iran because Iran is Turkey's direct route by land into Central Asia. I mean, Iran is a direct route into the Central Asian Turkic countries. So right here, you have Turkmenistan. Up here, you have Kazakhstan. So Iran is Turkey's direct land route into Central Asia. Now, what does Turkey want to do? What is Turkey's aspiration here, geopolitically speaking? Turkey's aspiration is to establish a pan-Turkic confederacy. This is Turkey's plan. They want to create a confederacy of Turkic countries with Turkey as the leader. They want to create a Turkic NATO, so to speak. And so that would include Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, the Turkic countries, maybe Hungary, because Hungary is called Hungary because it was invaded by the Huns, and the Huns were a Turkic people. And so they want to create this Turkic union. You can't really create this Turkic union unless you have a unfettered direct access route into Central Asia. So Iran is absolutely vital for Turkey, geopolitically speaking. Here you have the Turkic countries, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. Turkey wants unfettered direct access to this part of the world. How does it do that? It needs Iran. So Turkey already has Azerbaijan. From Azerbaijan, it simply has to sail across the sea and it's in the Turkic motherland. But it wants a direct land route, not just a sea route. So that's where Iran comes into play. So you have Turkey, Iran. From Iran, direct access to Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. Direct access into Central Asia. From Iran, Turkey also has direct access into Afghanistan and Pakistan. And remember what I talked about before. Turkey is deepening its security ties with the Iranians and the Pakistanis. Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan all together against Israel. The whole Turkic world, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. From Iran, you have access to Pakistan. Now, I've talked about this before, but I'll talk about it again. Turkey is deepening its security ties with Pakistan and Iran. From Pakistan to Turkey, there is a direct route, direct corridor. From Pakistan, Iran to Turkey. There is an unfettered link. If the Ayatollah is overthrown, Turkey will further deepen its ties with the Iranian government because at this point, Iran will be aligned with NATO and Turkey is a member of NATO. So it'll be much easier for Turkey to intensify and to strengthen its security ties with the Iranians. So the Turco-Iranian axis will only be strengthened by the overthrowing of the Ayatollah. So you'll have a stronger Iranian axis. Turkey is going to have Iran as a very strong ally, which means Turkey has this direct access into Central Asia, which means Turkey is further enabled to establish a pan-Turkic union. If there is a pan-Turkic NATO with Turkey as the leader, this pan-Turkic axis, of which Iran will be a part of, or at least Iran will be an ally of, will become a massive threat to the Russians, to the Israelis. NATO will not mind this because it will mean Central Asia being aligned with NATO. Now, if you look at the Mackinder philosophy of geopolitics, whoever controls Central Asia controls the world. Russia wants to control Central Asia because it means Russia having access to literally unlimited amounts of resources. We're talking uranium, we're talking natural gas, we're talking oil. Whoever controls Central Asia is the dominant power of the earth. You have all this unlimited access to uranium, natural gas, and oil, and other things as well. So if you have this massive Turkic union, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Turkey is leading it, Turkey becomes the dominant power of Asia. NATO could then use this dominant Turkic power as a proxy against not just the Russians up here, but against the Chinese. And this is where the Uyghurs come in. Because right here in this part of China, you have the Xinjiang province. Now, in the Xinjiang province, you have Uyghurs who want to separate from China. I'm not saying all Uyghurs are this way. You have plenty of Uyghurs who are loyal to Beijing. But they are Uyghurs nonetheless who want separatism from the Chinese. And they want to join the other Central Asian countries as an Islamic nation. There is a paramilitary organization that comes from Xinjiang. It's called TIP. TIP, I believe, stands for the Turkmenistan Islamic Party or something like this. They say, we are Uyghurs. We are originally Turkmen people. We are Turkic. We're not. We don't want to be under the thumb of the Han Chinese. They want independence. Turkey, of course, has been capitalizing on this reality, and Turkey armed and trained the TIP, the Uyghur paramilitary organization. Turkey used the Uyghur fighters as a proxy against the Assad government in Syria. One of the forces that the Assad government had to fight was the Uyghur paramilitary organization known as TIP. TIP was vital in the revolution to overthrow the Assad government. In their combat, in their battles against the Syrian military, the Uyghur separatists received combat experience. You see, this is why this is so important. The Turks and NATO, really America, wants to use these Uyghurs because now they have combat experience. They want to use these Uyghurs to spark a revolution in China against Beijing. So the idea is to use this pan-Turkic power bloc with its unlimited resources of oil, natural gas, and uranium against the Russians, but also against the Chinese, to spark revolution within China, to force China to be bogged down in a civil war, which will deplete China of manpower, soldiers, and which will weaken the Chinese, and to also use the Japanese on the east, on China's east, to hit the Chinese from the east, to weaken China and to kill as many Chinese people as possible. This is the reality here. This is the reality of America's goal. They want to kill as many Chinese people and as many Russians as possible, to weaken these two powers, to remove them as economic enemies and rivals of the American empire. The whole goal is to kill as many Russians as possible. Like, that is the entire goal, is to kill as many Russians and as many Chinese as possible to weaken these countries. So, listen, everyone knew that Ukraine wasn't going to win this war. Everyone. And if anyone said, well, Ukraine could win this, all of the evil people in the U.S. government, in the American media empire, in the British media, in the British government, who were saying, they can win this, just keep going, they are all liars. They were all liars, and they lied to push people to go to war, to push Ukrainians to go to war. And the whole idea was to egg on the Ukrainians to continue the war so that more Russians could die. Because yes, we know that the Russians are going to win. We always knew that the Russians were going to win this war. Obviously, Russia is the bigger country. Russia has just a better military, a much larger military. Regardless of the inevitability of a Russian victory, Russians have died in this war, and Russians continue to be killed in this war. Yeah, Russia's going to win this war, but it's coming at a cost. And the cost is a lot of dead Russians. So it's just a big meat grinder. Yeah, it's a meat grinder for the Ukrainians, but it's also a meat grinder for the Russians. And hundreds of thousands of Russians have been killed and wounded in this war. So a lot of Russians have come back home with missing limbs. And that's exactly what NATO wants, because a dead Russian soldier means one less Russian soldier to worry about. And with every single Russian soldier that is killed, Russia gets a little bit weaker. That's the whole point. So China right now is not in a war, but that's going to change. And they want China to go to war. That's why they keep sending weapons to Taiwan, because they want to provoke the Chinese to go to war. That's the whole idea. My hope is that the Chinese don't fall for it, and they don't fall for the provocation. But my fear is that they are going to eventually fall for the provocation, and they might try to invade Taiwan, or they might just go to war with Japan. Who knows? But eventually there's going to be blood on the Pacific Ocean. And the Americans will love it. And there's going to be a war between China and Japan. And people say, well, Japan's going to lose. Japan's going to lose. Yeah, okay, fine. Japan's going to lose. Sure. You think you're a genius because you say that, but that's not the point. The point is not for the Japanese to win or for the Ukrainians to win. The point is to kill as many Chinese and as many Russians as possible. Because if you have a lot of dead... Believe me, if China and Japan ever go to war again, a lot of Chinese people are going to die. I mean, that's just the fact. A lot of Chinese people are going to die. It's going to be a meat grinder. They're going to fight over... Because here's what people don't understand about wars. People see a big, massive country like China, and they see a smaller country like Japan. Or they see a big, massive country like Russia, and they see a smaller country like Ukraine, and they say, well, obviously, the bigger country is going to beat the smaller country, and obviously it's going to be a cakewalk for the bigger country to beat the smaller country. That's not entirely how wars work. Read about any war in history. Any war. 100 Years' War, 30 Years' War, World War I, World War II, Crimean War, it doesn't matter. Read about every major war in history. Peloponnesian War. It always comes down to the two sides, the two warring sides, fighting over very small areas, fighting over very small strips of territory. Yeah, Russia, land-wise, is a massive country. It's very difficult to invade Russia. But most of Russia is not inhabited. Most of the Russian population is concentrated in certain areas within Russia's borders. And so, yeah, you can have a really big country and a lot of people, but it doesn't matter how small your enemy is. You're going to find yourself fighting over small strips of territory. And what tends to happen is a bottleneck situation where you'll have droves of soldiers coming from both sides, and they're going to fight over one little area, one little region. I mean, look at, the whole infamous battle between the Spartans and the Persians. How was it possible? Yeah, sure, the 300 Spartans that everyone talks about were eventually killed in battle. How were they able to kill so many Persians? I mean, they were able to kill literally tens of thousands of Persians. Persia had a bigger military than Sparta. But how were the Spartans able to kill so many Persians before being killed themselves? The reality is that, yeah, the Persians had a bigger military. They had more soldiers than the 300 Spartans, obviously. But what it came down to was fighting over a small strip of territory. And all the Spartans did was they found an area where they couldn't be flanked. They found, I think it was a narrow corridor of some sort. They just positioned themselves within that narrow area where it was impossible for the Persians to flank them. And they just sat there. And they just killed Persians as the Persians came. It was that simple. England had a much smaller population than the French during the 100 Years' War. And yet you can read about these massive battles between the French and the English, in which the English are completely outnumbered, but the English still crushed the French overwhelmingly in a single battle. How is that possible? Because they would fight over these small little territories, and the English would just position themselves in sort of a narrow area, and they would just hit the French with arrows and kill as many French as they could. I mean, for the most part, that's what happens in wars. America is a lot larger than Vietnam, but how come American soldiers were so scared shitless to go fight in Vietnam? I mean, Vietnam is a much smaller country than America. Vietnam didn't have a navy. Vietnam didn't have an air force. Vietnam did not have a serious armed forces. But still, Americans were scared shitless to go fight in Vietnam. Why? Because they found themselves fighting in tight spaces. And when you find yourself fighting in tight spaces, be it within jungles, or be it within the countryside of France, or be it within some little beach area within Greece, it is very difficult to fight. The Romans had a much larger military than the Germanians did. But still, the Germanians were able to crush the Romans in the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. How was that possible? Because the Romans found themselves in a tight space within a forest. And they couldn't face these tall German warriors where there were just trees everywhere. Imagine trying to fight people and there's trees everywhere. It's very difficult to fight in a tight space. So anytime a smaller, weaker country finds itself fighting a much stronger country, it will always try to lure the stronger side to a tight space. And that's how you beat them. That's how you beat a bigger opponent. So this is the reality of war that I hear people rarely ever talk about. And so Russia and Ukraine right now, they're fighting over a territory that's roughly the size of Delaware within eastern Ukraine. That's what the Russians are doing right now. They're fighting over a small slither of territory that's about the size of Delaware. And it's a little meat grinder. So yeah, Russia's winning, and Russia is going to win. And more than likely, there's going to be territorial concessions made to the Russians. More than likely. We have yet to see. But that's, if negotiations are done and they're actually carried through to a certain extent, concessions will be made. But the Americans and the European Union, the Germans, the British, the French, they want this war to carry on for as long as possible, and they want to crank out as many Ukrainian soldiers into this meat grinder as much as possible, because with every dead Russian, Russia is just a little bit weaker. This has been the goal of the British since forever. Go read about the Crimean War. I was reading a little bit about the Crimean War last night. Very fascinating story. I should be reading more about the Crimean War. The Crimean War was a war that was launched by the British and the French to defend the Ottoman Empire against the Russians. Russia was not communist at the time. It was under the Tsars. And so it doesn't really matter if Russia is under Orthodox Christianity or under communism. The West is going to hate Russia. And the Russians were fighting the Ottomans in the Caucasus. They were also fighting the Ottomans in what is now known as Romania, so Wallachia, that area. And the British and the French intervened in the war, and what that did was it forced the Russians to withdraw from the Caucasus region and from the Romania region, and the Russians withdrew into Crimea. And the British and the French decided to strike the Russians in Crimea. Now, Russia is much larger than Britain and France. The Russians had a very massive military. But who won that war? It wasn't the Russians. The Russians lost that war. The Russians lost the Crimean War. Why? Because the war was reduced to a tight space, Crimea. And hundreds of thousands of Russians lost their lives fighting for Crimea. And hundreds of thousands of French and British also were killed fighting in Crimea. Many bodies are still buried in Crimea from that war. And the Russians lost. And the Turks got empowered. And what do you see happening today? The British, the French, the Americans, they want war with the Russians. They want to weaken Russia's position. Where? The Caucasus? Eastern Europe, Crimea, on the Black Sea. Nothing's changed. It's the same thing. It's the same actors. It's the same mission. And so what do you see? You see Turkey crushing Russia's ally Armenia in the South Caucasus. That right there is NATO and Russia's war over the Caucasus. You see the Russians in Crimea to defend Crimea. They need Crimea because they need that as a naval outpost in the case of war against the Turks, in the case of war against any other power that wants to encroach upon Russia's position in the Black Sea, but especially Turkey, because Turkey is a massive Black Sea power. And why did Russia decide to annex Crimea in the first place? The reason why Russia decided to annex Crimea is because the Ukrainian government was talking about throwing the Russians out of Crimea. They were talking about removing Russia's naval base in Crimea. Russia has a massive naval base in Crimea, and the Russians said, we can't afford to lose Crimea. And so Russia annexed Crimea. The British and the Turks and the French, they want to throw the Russians out of Crimea, just like they did during the Crimean War. So nothing's really changed. It's all the same thing. And you see the American empire, NATO, trying to push Russia out of Eastern Europe, trying to push Russia out of Ukraine and out of Belarus, and they want to take over Ukraine and Belarus. And if you look at NATO's boundary in Europe, NATO's boundary line in Europe goes from Finland all the way down into the Black Sea. And so right now, the American empire, NATO and Russia, they're fighting over who's going to control that space around the Black Sea. Who's going to control Ukraine? And the American empire is trying to push the Russians out. They know the Ukrainians are going to lose. They don't care. That's the thing. They don't give a damn. They want to kill as many Russians as possible because they want to weaken the Russians, and they want to pull China into a war because they want to kill as many Chinese as possible because they want to weaken China, because they want to remove their biggest military and economic rivals. China is America's biggest economic rival. Russia is America's biggest military rival. They want to push the Russians out. And that's why they want the Turks to establish a pan-Turkic union. Because if the Central Asian Turkic countries like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan join Turkey against the Russians, that would mean a massive, massive Turkic bloc that NATO could use against the Russians. And it'll be very difficult for the Russians to win in a war against such massive powers. Imagine Turkey leading Central Asia against the Russians. Imagine all of Europe going against Russia. It would be just an absolute bloodbath and really horrific. So it's what is being planned for the future is nothing good. And in 2026, we're going to be seeing more and more militarism, more European militarism. And in 2027, that militarism is going to be on steroids. It's going to be even more intense. It's going to be even more fanatical. And the Europeans are really going to take the mask off. You're going to be seeing the Europeans talking more militaristically and more nationalistically. And the Europeans, specifically the Germans, are going to really deepen their ties with the Turks because they want to use the Turks against the Russians. Just like the British and the French went to war against Russia to defend the Turks in the Crimean War.